Hi guys, welcome to my presentation of the endocrine system. First, we're going to go over the general principles of the endocrine system and how it works and how it's regulated. Then we'll go through specific hormones. So the endocrine system contains organs that make hormones. A hormone is a signaling molecule that is secreted into the blood. So in order for something to count as a hormone, it has to carry a message and it has to travel in the blood. There's actually a lot of organs that release hormones and also just tissues that release hormones that aren't considered to be part of the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is including those organs that release a hormone as kind of their primary function or one of their most important functions. There's also some organs that are counted as in the endocrine system and also in a different organ system. For instance, the pancreas is part of the endocrine system because it releases the hormones insulin and glucagon that are the primary hormones responsible for controlling blood sugar. But it also is in the digestive system because it secretes digestive enzymes into the intestine that allow you to digest your food. The main roles of the endocrine system are to maintain homeostasis, to kind of coordinate the growth and development of the organism, to coordinate the reproductive functions of the organism, and to allow an organism to respond to stress or emergencies. The endocrine system works together with the nervous system to accomplish those goals. So the endocrine system and nervous system coordinate with each other to maintain the functions of the body and to control the functions of each organ. There's some differences between neural control and endocrine control. Endocrine control is slow to get going, where neural control is fast to get going. So if you have neural control, that means you have axons traveling to a target cell, and you're going to have action potentials traveling down those axons and causing neurotransmitter to be released that then will affect the target cell. So that control is basically at the speed of the action potential, which is very fast. So when the nervous system, for instance, when the sympathetic nervous system activates, all of the target cells respond very quickly because action potentials are traveling quickly along those axons. Even the ones that are not myelinated, it's still pretty fast. In contrast, for the endocrine system, hormones have to be made, released into the blood. Then you have to have the concentration of hormone in the blood rise to be large enough to have an effect, and then it has to travel to the target cells and affect them. So that takes a lot longer to get going because you spend a lot of time manufacturing hormones and pumping them or secreting them into the blood to raise the concentration to a noticeable level. Then another difference is that neural control doesn't last for a long time, but endocrine control does. So with neural control, as soon as the action potentials stop traveling along the axon, as soon as you stop having action potentials, you're going to stop having the effects. So when the sympathetic nervous system deactivates, it deactivates essentially right away, and all of its effects stop basically right away. With the endocrine system, once you've secreted a hormone into the blood, it's there in the blood until you do something to remove it. And it's going to have its effects as long as it's there in the blood. So the effects are going to be much longer lasting. They'll be lasting probably for at least for hours. It generally takes a long time to remove hormones from the blood. A final difference is that the nervous system has to have a direct link to the target cells that it's controlling. That means that it has to have axons that travel to those target cells and release neurotransmitter onto them. In contrast, the endocrine system does not need a direct link with its target cells. It doesn't have to be anatomically connected to those cells because the hormone is going to travel in the blood to get to the target cells. That's really convenient because it's just not really practical to have axons traveling to every single cell in your body to control those cells. But every single cell in your body does have access to the blood. So hormones in the blood will be distributed to the whole body and affect potentially every cell in your body. Then I guess the final point is just that the nervous system is usually in control of hormone release. There's some exceptions to that. There's some hormones that are controlled in different ways, but the nervous system usually is either primarily responsible for controlling hormone release from endocrine organs, or it can play some role in controlling the release of hormones. So there's kind of a lot of crine words. Endocrine can refer to a type of secretion, the secretion of a hormone specifically. It also refers to signaling between cells or cell communication using hormones. But all the time, endocrine is associated with hormones. So endocrine means hormones. And a hormone is a signaling molecule in the blood. You also have paracrine, that's another type of cell communication, and autocrine, another type of cell communication. In paracrine communication, you have a signaling molecule that travels through the extracellular matrix to target cells that are close by. It does not enter the blood. In autocrine communication, you have a signaling molecule travel through the extracellular matrix back to the same cell that released it. If one of those signaling molecules enters the blood, it then counts as a hormone, so that would mean that that's endocrine communication, not paracrine or autocrine. Endocrine secretion is just the secretion of a hormone into the blood. You also have exocrine secretion. Exocrine secretion involves some type of substance being released onto a surface of the body. That could mean the skin, the external surface, but it could also be an internal surface, like the gastrointestinal tract. So when the pancreas releases digestive enzymes into your intestine, that is exocrine secretion. But when the pancreas releases hormones into the blood, when it releases insulin into the blood, that is endocrine secretion. So paracrine and autocrine are types of cell communication. Exocrine is a type of secretion. Endocrine is both a type of secretion and a type of cell communication, all based on hormones. There's a little bit of debate on which organs should be part of the endocrine system. These are the organs that are counted as part of the endocrine system by the textbook. And of course, for some of them, there's no debate at all. So the pituitary gland, let's see, the pituitary gland is found at the base of the brain, just beneath the hypothalamus, right there. That's part of the endocrine system. You also have the pineal gland, that's also coming off the back of the diencephalon in the brain, right there. Also part of the endocrine system is the thyroid gland in your throat and the parathyroid gland that's actually right next to it. Then you have the adrenal glands. Those are on top of the kidneys. The pancreas is considered part of the endocrine system. The testes if you're a man, or the ovaries if you're a woman. And then the thymus is in your chest. That's considered part of the endocrine system by the textbook, but there's actually a lot of people who don't think that thymus should be in the endocrine system. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the thymus specifically. Other than that, you have the hypothalamus right here in the brain. That's generally considered part of the endocrine system. The book counts it as an endocrine organ. Personally, I don't think it isn't, well, it's not an organ. It's part of an organ, it's part of the brain, but undoubtedly it is properly belonging to the endocrine system because it does release hormones. And it also controls the release of hormone from other glands that are in the endocrine system. So we'll go through each of those organs and the hormones they release when we talk about the specific hormones. You also have other organs in the body that release important hormones. Those include the bones, the kidneys, the liver, heart, stomach, the intestines, and just adipose tissue. You have two basic types of hormone, peptide hormones and steroid hormones. The peptide hormones are water soluble. They're made of amino acids. They're just like short short proteins made of amino acids, and they can dissolve in water. They're hydrophilic. Then your steroid hormones are a type of lipid. They're actually all synthesized from cholesterol, which is found in the membranes of all cells. So since they are lipids, they are not soluble in water. They're soluble in other lipids instead, so they're hydrophobic. It's the difference in solubility between those two hormone classes that determines all of the other differences between them. So if you just remember which one is water soluble and which one is lipid soluble, that'll help you figure out the other differences. For your peptide hormones, those being water soluble are also soluble in the blood, which means that they can just enter the blood and travel freely in the blood. For your steroid hormones, since they're lipid soluble, they are not soluble in the blood. Blood is mostly water, so anything that's not water soluble can't dissolve in the blood. That means that if your steroid hormones are going to travel through the blood, they have to have a protein that's water soluble that will bind to them and carry them around in the blood. So every steroid hormone has a carrier protein or a transport protein that takes it through the blood. They don't travel freely in the blood. Then when your peptide hormones arrive at their target cells, they bind a receptor that's on the surface of the cell. That's because since they're water soluble, they cannot cross a cell membrane. The cell membrane on the inside is made of lipids, so anything that's water soluble can't get across it. Your steroid hormones, on the other hand, since they are a lipid, they can cross a cell membrane. So they'll actually just diffuse right across the cell membrane and bind an intracellular receptor, a receptor that is inside of the target cell. So let's see. In the image here on the left, you have your peptide hormones, or a general peptide hormone. On the right, you have a steroid hormone. Your peptide hormones are released by exocytosis. Sorry if you could hear the noise there. That's my kitty cat. So your peptide hormones are released from the endocrine cells that make them by exocytosis. Then they enter the bloodstream and travel freely through the blood to their target cells. Then they leave the blood and bind to a receptor on the surface of the target cell. For your steroid hormones, they can diffuse right across the membrane of the cell that releases them, so they don't need exocytosis to get out. Then they travel in the blood attached to a carrier protein, which would be shown there in blue. When they get to their target cell, they have to let go of the carrier protein, and then they can diffuse across the membrane of that target cell, just entering the cell, and they bind an intracellular receptor inside of the target cell. There's a few exceptions to those differences, but they generally hold true. So you don't need to know the details of these mechanisms at all, actually, but we'll briefly go over them. So for your peptide or protein hormones, in general, they're going to bind, well, they always bind a receptor on the surface of the cell. And in general, that receptor is a G protein coupled receptor. So when the hormone binds to it, the G protein will detach and go and do something else. A lot of the time, what it does is activate the enzyme adenylate cyclase. That converts ATP into the signaling molecule CAMP, which is actually properly called cyclic AMP, not CAMP at all. And then CAMP will go on to do something else. Generally, it'll activate other enzymes. For instance, it could activate protein kinase A or pKa, and then that enzyme that got activated is going to do whatever effect it has. Protein kinase A is always adding phosphate groups to different proteins. A lot of proteins can be turned on or off by adding a phosphate group to them. So when this happens, when this hormone attaches to its receptor, that's going to kick off all of these intracellular effects that ends up ultimately changing the function of these proteins that had a phosphate group added to them. So that changes the functions of the proteins in the cell. It's also possible for these peptide hormones to change the gene expression of the cell. It's just a little bit less common. For your steroid hormones, again, you don't need to know the details of this general mechanism at all, but we will go over it. So your steroid hormone is going to diffuse right across the cell membrane of its target cell and bind to a receptor inside that cell. Generally, once the hormone is bound to its receptor, that complex is going to enter the nucleus and bind to DNA. It'll bind to a gene, and it will either cause the expression of that gene or prevent the expression of that gene. Gene expression, if you remember from 1306, is just using a gene to make protein. It's making proteins based on your genes. So when you're expressing a gene, you're actually making protein. This hormone receptor complex is going to cause you to make protein or stop making protein using different genes. So it's changing what proteins are present in the cell. So both these types of hormones are able to change the function of the cell. Your peptide hormones usually do it by changing whether proteins that are already in the cell are on or off, and your steroid hormones usually do it by changing which proteins are present in the cell in the first place. But you actually have a number of exceptions to that rule, to that difference. Okay, so regulating hormones in the body basically consists of controlling when they're made and controlling when they're degraded. There's several ways to stimulate the production or the secretion of hormones. There's a couple ways to do it that involve the nervous system, that are under the control of the nervous system. And then there's another way to do it directly at the endocrine organ itself. So one way of causing hormones to be synthesized would be using the nervous system to directly stimulate endocrine cells to release hormone. An example of that is the release of hormone from the adrenal medulla, which is the inner part of the adrenal gland. So when we talked about the sympathetic nervous system, we talked about how you have axons of the sympathetic nervous system that travel to the adrenal medulla and cause those cells to release epinephrine into the blood as a hormone. That's direct stimulation of the endocrine organ by the nervous system to cause it to release hormones. The nervous system can also cause hormones to be released indirectly through the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus can tell the pituitary gland to release a hormone, and then that hormone travels to another endocrine organ and tells that organ to release a hormone. So in general, the hypothalamus would secrete a releasing hormone that would travel into the pituitary. When that releasing hormone gets to the pituitary, it makes the pituitary release a hormone, which would be a stimulating hormone. That hormone travels in the blood to some other endocrine organ and makes that organ release a hormone. So for instance, the hypothalamus releases TRH, which travels into the anterior pituitary and causes the release of TSH, which travels in the blood to the thyroid and makes the thyroid gland release thyroid hormone. TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, and TRH is thyrotropin releasing hormone, which just means that it's the hormone that makes TSH be released. So you have a lot of hormones that are controlled that way through the pituitary, actually, and we'll go through them. We'll go through each of them in turn. Then the last way that hormones can be released is by the endocrine organ itself sensing the concentration of something in the blood. So for instance, the pancreas is able to sense the concentration of your blood sugar, how much glucose you have in your blood, and it will release hormones depending on that concentration. So now we'll go into more detail with the hormones that are controlled indirectly through the hypothalamus and the pituitary. The pituitary actually has two parts. It has a front part, which is the anterior pituitary, and it has a back part, which is the posterior pituitary. It's only the anterior pituitary that's involved in causing other endocrine organs to release hormone. So your hypothalamus releases a releasing hormone that travels into the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary releases a stimulating hormone that travels to a target endocrine organ. Then that endocrine organ releases a hormone of its own. That organ or that hormone has whatever effects it has, and then you generally also have negative feedback to prevent the further release of stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary and the release of releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So one endocrine organ that's controlled in that way is the thyroid gland. The hypothalamus releases TRH that travels to the anterior pituitary, causes the anterior pituitary to release TSH. TSH travels to the thyroid gland and causes the release of thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone controls the metabolism rate of your body, and it also has negative feedback. So it's going to prevent the release of TSH from the anterior pituitary, and it's going to prevent the release of TRH from the hypothalamus. The purpose of that is to keep your levels of hormone steady. So that when you release thyroid hormone, you stop releasing thyroid hormone so you don't release too much. If you have too much, it's of any hormone really, it's going to be a problem. In this way, you always have kind of a stable amount of hormone in your blood. So that's the thyroid hormone, but you also have other hormones controlled in that way. Hormones that come from the adrenal cortex, which is the outer part of the adrenal gland, are controlled through the pituitary. So you have the hypothalamus releasing CRH that travels to the anterior pituitary, that causes the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. That travels to the adrenal cortex and causes the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids. Those are actually stress hormones that help you respond to stress. In addition to that, those hormones are going to negatively feed back onto the anterior pituitary, preventing the release of ACTH, and onto the hypothalamus, preventing the release of CRH. Then you have GnRH from the hypothalamus controlling your sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen. So GnRH is released from the hypothalamus. It travels to the anterior pituitary. It causes the anterior pituitary to release two stimulating hormones, actually, FSH and LH. Those are going to travel to the ovaries in a woman, causing the release of estrogen, or in a man, they would travel to the testes and cause the release of testosterone. Estrogen and testosterone kind of coordinate the function of your reproductive organs, as well as other things, and they also negatively feed back, preventing the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary, and preventing the release of GnRH from the hypothalamus. Then finally you have GHRH and growth hormone. So GHRH is released from the hypothalamus, travels to the anterior pituitary, causes the anterior pituitary to release GH, which is growth hormone. Growth hormone has some effects of its own, but it also travels to the liver and causes the liver to release the hormone IGF. Then IGF actually causes growth and cell division in your body, and it also negatively feeds back, preventing the release of GH, of growth hormone, from the anterior pituitary, and preventing the release of GHRH from the hypothalamus. The last hormone that's released from the anterior pituitary is prolactin, or PRL. So you have PRH that's released from the hypothalamus that travels to the anterior pituitary, causing it to release PRL, or prolactin. Then prolactin actually does not control any other endocrine organ. Its role is to stimulate milk production from the mammary glands. And we'll go over each of these hormones, again, and in more detail. So that's how you're synthesizing hormones. You also have several ways to remove hormones from the blood. One thing you can do is have the target cells release enzymes that actually degrade the hormone. The liver also has enzymes that degrade hormones from the blood. Finally, you could have the hormone be excreted into the urine by the kidneys. So you can either break it down using enzymes or you can excrete it into the urine. If the target cell is enzymatically degrading the hormone, then the hormone would actually have its effects on the target cell and then be degraded. If it's degraded by enzymes in the liver or if it's excreted into the urine, then that's kind of going to just be happening as it's circulating. So it may or may not have had its effect on the target cells before it's degraded or excreted into the urine. How quickly hormones are removed from the blood depends on if they're a peptide hormone or a steroid hormone. Your steroid hormones can't be excreted into the urine and they can't be enzymatically degraded if they're attached to their transport proteins. So they have to let go of the transport protein before they can have an effect or be removed from the blood. So that means that when you release steroid hormones, they last a lot longer in the blood than peptide hormones do, because you'll always have a pool of those steroid hormones that's attached to their transport proteins. Then they're kind of slowly released from the transport proteins so they can have an effect and be removed. For any hormone, and actually for any drug, any medical drug, you always have a half-life for it. The half-life is the amount or the length of time it takes for the amount of hormone in the blood to go down by half. So if you've released like 10 micrograms of epinephrine into the blood, by the time the half-life has passed, you'll have 5 micrograms left. That also applies to any medicine that you eat. Every medicine has a half-life. You also have negative feedback, which is very important in regulating the release of hormones. So we already kind of talked about negative feedback for hormones that are controlled through the anterior pituitary gland. You also have other hormones that inhibit their own release through negative feedback. It's a really good way of stabilizing the level of hormone in the blood so it doesn't get too high. It's generally really important that the level doesn't get too high. So here it's shown again for the thyroid hormone. So you have TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone, coming from the hypothalamus that travels into the anterior pituitary gland, causes the release of the stimulating hormone TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, that travels in the blood to the thyroid gland and causes the release of thyroid hormone. T3 and T4 are actually both thyroid hormones. Those have their effects to set the basic metabolic rate of the body, and they also negatively feedback, preventing the release of TSH from the anterior pituitary and preventing the release of TRH from the hypothalamus. That way, when you get more thyroid hormone, you stop making more in the future and you don't end up having like a big spike in your thyroid hormone levels, which would cause you to basically eat your own muscles and stuff and kind of waste away. It's pretty bad to have too much thyroid hormone. So those feedback loops, those negative feedback loops, are really important for all hormones that are controlled through the anterior pituitary. Oh, this is the same thing again with this. Okay, so now we'll go through the specific hormones. Please bear in mind, this is not a complete list of all the hormones in your body, not even close. Actually, you have very, very many hormones in your body. We're only going to go over some of the most common and most important ones. Also, for each hormone that we talk about, we're not going to talk about all the effects that it has. Every hormone has like a long list of effects that it has. It'll usually have like a few main effects, and those are the ones that we'll talk about. either one main effect or, maybe a couple or several main effects that it has. And then it'll also have a bunch of kind of secondary effects that are less prominent, but still could be important. It gets really complicated. A lot of hormones affect each other, kind of affecting their own, their own release or the release of other hormones. A lot of hormones affect the same thing, so you can actually have a lot of different hormones that affect blood sugar, not just the hormones from the pancreas that are kind of mostly in control of it. So they're all kind of working together to control the release of hormones and to regulate homeostasis in the body. Sometimes if you're taking hormones as a medicine, you might be taking kind of a higher dose, and then some of those secondary effects that are kind of less obvious usually would become more prominent and would become side effects of the drug that you're taking. There's a couple of words that describe some of the effects that hormones can have. There's tropic and then there's trophic. A tropic hormone is a hormone that stimulates the release of another hormone. So thyrotropin releasing hormone is called thyrotropin because it's stimulating the release of another hormone that's related to the thyroid gland. A trophic hormone is stimulating the growth of some tissue or some organ, so it's stimulating cell division. So growth hormone or IGF that make you grow, those are trophic hormones. Growth hormone also causes the release of IGF, so that means that growth hormone also is a tropic hormone and a trophic hormone. It's tropic and trophic. So be careful about the difference there, since it's only one. So we'll look at the anatomy of the hypothalamus and pituitary in a little more detail. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary with the little stalk. This little stalk here, it's commonly called the pituitary stalk, but the fancy pants name for it is infundibulum. So in our dissection specimens, the stalk was usually broken actually, but I think maybe one group got to see it. It's really thin and delicate. Then you have two lobes of the pituitary. You have the anterior part of the pituitary, the anterior lobe, and then you have the posterior lobe of the pituitary. Those are different. They have a different connection to the hypothalamus. In the anterior pituitary, you actually have blood vessels that are coming from the hypothalamus and draining into the anterior pituitary. Oh yeah, they're shown over here. All right, so here's these blood vessels coming to the hypothalamus and then traveling to the anterior pituitary. So the only real connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary is these blood vessels. For the posterior pituitary, you don't have blood vessels connecting them. Instead, you have axons that come from neurons in the hypothalamus. So you have these neurons in the hypothalamus that send their axons down into the pituitary stalk and into the posterior pituitary lobe. These neurons actually make hormones. One of the hormones they make is oxytocin, like the lovey-dovey hormone. Well, it's also a neurotransmitter. That would be synthesized by these neurons and then travel down the axon, and it's going to be released into the blood vessels in the posterior pituitary. So hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary are actually being made by neurons in the hypothalamus. They just happen to be released at the posterior pituitary. For the anterior pituitary, you have neurons in the hypothalamus that send their axons to the blood vessels in the hypothalamus that will ultimately be going to the anterior pituitary. These neurons make hormones. For instance, they make TRH that would travel down these axons and be released into these blood vessels where it travels down the pituitary stalk into the anterior pituitary. When it gets there, it's going to cause these cells inside of the anterior pituitary to make hormone. In this case, they would be making TSH. They'd be releasing that into these blood vessels, and then it's going to travel out to the rest of the circulatory system. So the fancy name for the anterior pituitary is the adenohypophysis, and the fancy name for the posterior pituitary is the neurohypophysis. But you don't need to know those. You don't need to know the fancy names actually, or the infundibulum. The regular names are fine. And then let's see. I should also talk about how these veins are portal veins, right? The veins that connect, or the blood vessels that connect the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, are portal veins. They're called portal veins because they're running between two capillary beds. So in general, when you have blood leaving the heart, it leaves in an artery that is going to branch and get smaller and smaller until it gets to the actual tissues where you're going to have oxygen being delivered. At that point, you have a capillary bed, a little network of tiny blood vessels that branch and have really thin walls so the oxygen can cross easily. Then on the other side of the capillary bed, you have a vein exiting that is going to carry the blood back to the heart. Right, so here in red, you have the artery coming in to the hypothalamus. Then that branches to make this capillary bed. Then you have veins coming out the other side of the capillary bed that are going to go back to the heart. In a portal vein, you have a capillary bed, the veins coming out of it, those would be the portal veins. Then you have another capillary bed. So most veins just go straight to the heart. They don't have another capillary bed. Portal veins do have this another capillary bed. They carry blood between two capillary beds. Okay, so here we're kind of zooming in on the portal vein system between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Right, so here you can see hormones being made by these neurons and traveling down the axon of the neuron, then being released into this capillary bed, then traveling through the portal veins down into the anterior pituitary, where they cause the release of other hormones, of stimulating hormones, that would also be released into this capillary bed and then travel out to the rest of the body. And this is a portal vein again because it connects two capillary beds. The most important portal vein in the body is the hepatic portal vein. It's going to the liver. It's the vein that goes into the liver. It's actually draining blood that comes from capillaries that kind of serve the digestive organs, so the stomach, the pancreas, and most of the intestines. So you would have blood coming from the heart going to the stomach, and then if it hits a capillary bed, oxygen is delivered to the tissue of the stomach, and then the blood drains into this vein, the portal vein, the hepatic portal vein, and it goes to, actually, sorry, this is the spleen, not the stomach, but it goes to the liver, where you have other capillary beds. The purpose of that is so that anything that you have absorbed from your intestine is going to go through the liver, where it can be detoxified, right? The main job of the liver is to detoxify the blood. So anything that got into your blood from, the outside world, from the GI tract, is going to be detoxified in the liver before it goes anywhere else in the body. That is pretty important, and it actually ends up affecting drugs. Some drugs are going to be degraded here in the liver so that they have less of an effect if you eat them orally. Other drugs are actually going to be activated by the enzymes in the liver, so they need to pass through here to have their effect. An example of that is actually codeine. Codeine, if you were to inject that into the brain, it doesn't do anything at all. You have to have it be metabolized by the liver. The liver actually metabolizes it to morphine, and then that affects the brain. And here we're going to talk about the posterior pituitary and the hormones released from the posterior pituitary. You have two of them. They are antidiuretic hormone, that's abbreviated ADH. The other word for antidiuretic hormone is vasopressin. So depending on where or what resource you're reading, you might see it called ADH or vasopressin. Then you have oxytocin, also released as a hormone from the posterior pituitary. Right, so oxytocin is also a neurotransmitter in the brain that's associated with well, usually associated with kind of lovey-dovey type of feelings or social connections. When it's released into the posterior pituitary veins, since it's going into the blood, it counts as a hormone now. So you have these neurons in the hypothalamus that make oxytocin and ADH, and then those hormones travel down the axons and are released into the blood vessels of the posterior pituitary. ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, the name tells you what it does. A diuretic drug is a drug that makes you pee. An antidiuretic drug would be a drug that makes you pee less. So antidiuretic hormone prevents the excretion of urine, or reduces the rate at which the kidneys are making urine. So it increases water retention, decreases water excretion, decreases urine production. When you're making less urine, but you're still drinking water, the volume of your blood goes up, and that means that the blood pressure is going to go up. So in general, ADH is released to maintain your blood pressure. Oxytocin, on the other hand, is mostly relevant in women. It stimulates milk ejection from the mammary glands, and it also stimulates the contraction of the uterus during childbirth. Okay, so we'll go into more detail with ADH. If you guys hear some hissing or something, it's, it's my one cat hissing at my other cat. They will not leave the room. So ADH release is controlled by the hypothalamus. You have special neurons in the hypothalamus called osmoreceptors. They can actually sense how much water is in your blood. The fancy way to say it is that they sense the osmotic pressure of your blood, but that's just how much water you have in the blood. If the osmoreceptors sense that you have not enough water in your blood, the water level is going down, then they're going to cause the release of ADH from the posterior pituitary. The other thing that they would do in that case is make you feel thirsty so that you go drink some water, right? So they're going to make you get thirsty and go get water. They're also going to make you release ADH so that you can make less urine, thereby hanging on to whatever water you have left. So the ADH would travel in the blood to the kidneys, which is of course the organ that makes your urine. In the kidneys, you have blood vessels going in, and you're going to have fluid filtering out from those blood vessels and entering these little tubules in the kidneys. The fluid is going to travel through those tubules until it turns into urine and exits the kidney, going to the bladder. As it's going through these tubules, its chemistry is actually being adjusted by the cells that line the tubules. So those cells are controlling how water moves in and out of the forming urine, and how different ions or different salts move in and out of the urine, to make sure it has just the optimal concentration, or the optimal chemical characteristics at the end. When you have ADH released, that goes and binds to receptors on these cells lining the kidney tubules. When the ADH binds, it's going to cause aquaporins to be put into the membranes of these cells. Aquaporins are special channels that let water cross the cell membrane. When you have a lot of aquaporins here in these cell membranes, you're going to have water leaving this fluid that's forming as the urine, crossing these cells and going out into the tissue of the kidney. Ultimately, it'll return to the blood. It's going to leave because you have more solutes outside of the kidney tubule than what you have inside. So it's leaving by osmosis. Ultimately, that means you're removing water from the forming urine and returning it to the blood, saving the water in your blood. So these are the hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary. You have TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Then you have ACTH, that's adrenocorticotropic hormone. Then you have FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. You have LH, luteinizing hormone. You have GH, which is growth hormone, and you have prolactin, also abbreviated as PRL. This table is showing you how those hormones are controlled. They're controlled by the hypothalamus. So you have releasing hormones that come from the hypothalamus and travel to the anterior pituitary and cause the release of all those hormones. You also have some hormones in the hypothalamus that prevent the release of hormone from the anterior pituitary. Those would be inhibitory hormones. So for TSH, its release is stimulated by TRH, but it's inhibited by somatostatin. For ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, its release is stimulated by CRH, or corticotropin-releasing hormone, from the hypothalamus. FSH and LH have their release stimulated by GnRH, that's gonadotropin-releasing hormone. GH, or growth hormone, has its release stimulated by GHRH, which is growth hormone-releasing hormone. Its release is inhibited by somatostatin. Then PRL, or prolactin, the book actually does say that its release is stimulated by PHRH, or prolactin, or well, just PRH, prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Actually, they haven't found that. They're just kind of figuring that it must be there. And you know, it probably is there, it's probably real, but they just haven't found it yet. So since it hasn't specifically been discovered, I have an NA here in my table. Then the release of prolactin is inhibited by dopamine from the hypothalamus. That would be dopamine released as a hormone into the portal vein between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. So that's not dopamine as a neurotransmitter. Then TSH goes on to cause the release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland. It doesn't do anything other than that. It does not have non-tropic effects. It is a tropic hormone causing the release of thyroid hormone. ACTH goes on to cause the release of glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids from the adrenal cortex. It also does not have non-tropic effects. It only has the effects of releasing these hormones. FSH and LH cause the release of estrogen, testosterone, and indirectly also progesterone, depending on if you're a man or a woman. And they do have non-tropic effects. So they cause the release of these hormones, that's their tropic effect, but they also do other things as well. Then you have growth hormone that causes the release of IGF from the liver. IGF is insulin-like growth factor. And growth hormone also has non-tropic effects. So it causes the release of IGF and it also does other things. Prolactin actually does not cause the release of any hormone. So it does not have tropic effects at all. Instead, it has non-tropic effects. Okay, so for those hormones from the anterior pituitary that have non-tropic effects, these would be those effects. Prolactin is primarily involved with stimulating milk production from the mammary glands. Growth hormone promotes growth. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone work together to coordinate the function of the reproductive system. They have different effects in men versus in women. So we'll kind of go into those effects in slightly more detail later on. So for growth hormone, its non-tropic effects would be to increase how many nutrients you have in your blood, so that your cells that are dividing so you can grow will have more nutrients available to them so they can do that. So it's going to increase lipolysis in your adipose tissue. That is the breakdown of fat to make energy. Specifically, that would give you fatty acids and glycerol. Fatty acids are going to be directly converted into energy. Glycerol would go to the liver where it's converted to glucose, and then glucose is used to make energy. It also stimulates the production of glucose by the liver, the breakdown of glycogen to make glucose in the liver. And it also reduces how much glucose is used by your muscles. That way, whatever glucose you have in your blood, you can use for your cells that need to divide so you can grow. The muscles won't use it instead. So it's actually not causing growth. It's just kind of supporting growth by allowing nutrients, by making sure that nutrients are there for your growing cells, but it doesn't actually tell cells to divide in general. Then it causes the liver to release IGF, and that's a tropic effect. IGF is insulin-like growth factor. IGF is what's really directly causing the growth. So IGF causes the cells in your body to divide. It causes them to make more protein, and it causes them to take glucose up from the blood so that they have fuel to make the protein and to divide. So it's actually IGF that's mostly responsible for the growth. But in order to make IGF, you have to have the growth hormone. And of course, if you don't put nutrients in your blood for your growing cells to use, then you're not going to be able to grow. Almost every cell in your body is affected by these two hormones, by growth hormone and by IGF. There would be especially affecting your bones and your skeletal muscles. Different cells in the body are going to kind of be affected in different ways by these hormones. They have a lot of effects, a lot of complicated effects on different types of cells. Okay, so one of the endocrine organs whose hormone release is controlled by the anterior pituitary is the ovaries in women. The ovaries are part of the endocrine system because they release estrogen and progesterone. They're also part of the reproductive system because they make eggs. Estrogen and progesterone both coordinate with each other and with FSH and LH to control the menstrual cycle. FSH and LH, of course, being from the anterior pituitary. Estrogen also, in addition to controlling the menstrual cycle, is responsible for the development of female secondary sexual characteristics. That would be stuff like the way that women have different hair growth patterns from men, the way that women are kind of like smaller than men and don't have as big of muscles. Those are all female secondary sexual characteristics. So that's kind of all the differences between men and women that are not related to the reproductive system itself. So essentially every cell in the body is affected by estrogen in one way or another, and it has a lot of really complicated effects on different cells, as people who take birth control may be aware. Progesterone, in addition to coordinating the menstrual cycle, is responsible for allowing pregnancy to continue. It builds up the wall of the uterus so that an egg can attach there and get sustenance as it grows, if it's fertilized. FSH and LH both are responsible for causing the release of estrogen from the ovaries. LH also stimulates the release of progesterone, but it does it indirectly. And then FSH and LH both have other effects. They both participate in controlling the menstrual cycle. So they're not just responsible for causing the release of estrogen or progesterone. And then in men, instead of the ovaries, you have the testes. So that's an endocrine organ because it releases testosterone, but it's also part of the reproductive system in men because it makes sperm. And it's also under the control of the anterior pituitary. Testosterone is responsible for making sperm, for sperm production, and for the male secondary sexual characteristics. The ways that men are visually different from women apart from the reproductive system itself, right? The way that they're taller and stronger, and the stuff like that. Testosterone's release is stimulated by LH, so it's actually only LH, or luteinizing hormone, that causes the release of testosterone. Both FSH and LH cause the release of estrogen, but only LH causes the release of testosterone from the testes. FSH is important in sperm production because it causes testosterone to be concentrated in the testes. Testosterone needs to have a high concentration in the testes for sperm to actually be produced, and it won't reach that concentration if you don't have the FSH. So FSH isn't involved in releasing testosterone, but it is very important for the function of testosterone. So just like estrogen, most cells, almost every cell in the body, is affected by testosterone in complicated ways. Then you also have FSH having additional effects in sperm production, not just the concentration of testosterone, but other things as well. Then the thyroid gland is partly controlled by the anterior pituitary. It releases two hormones, calcitonin and thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone, of course, is the one that's controlled by the anterior pituitary. Calcitonin is not. Calcitonin's role is to decrease the concentration of calcium in the blood. Calcium is a really important signaling molecule for every cell in the body. So you always need to have the right amount of calcium in your blood. If the calcium levels get too high, then calcitonin will be released from the thyroid gland and reduce the levels back to normal. Its release is controlled directly by the cells of the thyroid gland. They can sense how much calcium is in the blood. If the levels of calcium in the blood go up, then calcitonin will be released. If the calcium levels go down, then the thyroid gland will stop making calcitonin. One of the effects that calcitonin has is that it inhibits osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are cells in the bone that break down bone. You always have bone being made and being broken down at all times in like a balance. When calcitonin inhibits osteoclast activity, then you stop breaking bone down, but you still have the cells that make bone making bone. That means that you're taking calcium out of the blood and putting it into your bone. So when you release calcitonin, you remove calcium from your blood and incorporate it into your bones. Then thyroid hormone is responsible for setting the metabolic rate. When you have more thyroid hormone, your basal metabolic rate goes up, and if you have less, it goes down. Of course, thyroid hormone is controlled by the anterior pituitary, by TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. You actually have two different hormones that are both counting as thyroid hormone. You have T3 and you have T4. T3 is more functional. It has most of the effects, but then T4 lasts for a longer time in the blood. In order to make thyroid hormone, you need iodine. Iodine is incorporated into T3 and T4. So that's the reason why you need iodine. Well, that's the main reason why you need iodine in your diet. If you don't get it, you won't be able to make thyroid hormone. Okay, so thyroid hormone sets the basal metabolic rate. When it goes up, the basal metabolic rate will go up, and if it goes down, the basal metabolic rate will go down. The basal metabolic rate is just the rate at which you are breaking down protein, fat, and glucose and using them to make ATP. Okay, so a little more detail on thyroid hormone. It increases the basal metabolic rate, which means that it increases how fast ATP-dependent reactions are occurring. That would be reactions that require ATP. So that includes the breakdown of protein and fat and the synthesis of protein and fat. So overall, when your basal metabolic rate goes up, if it doesn't go up too much, you should have an equal rate of breakdown and synthesis of protein and fat. And it'll just increase the rate of breakdown and increase the rate of synthesis the same amount. So how much protein and fat you have in your body doesn't change, but the amount of ATP that you're using does change. The point of using ATP in that way is just to create heat as a byproduct. So every chemical reaction creates heat as a byproduct, and you use that heat to maintain your body temperature. So when you have more thyroid hormone, your basal metabolic rate goes up, your body temperature will go up. If you have less thyroid hormone, your basal metabolic rate goes down, your body temperature will go down, and you'll use less ATP. If thyroid hormone increases too much, then you're going to have the breakdown of protein and fat dominating over the synthesis of protein and fat, and you're going to be losing weight. If thyroid hormone is too low, then you're going to have the synthesis of protein and fat dominating. You're going to be gaining weight and just not using ATP as much. Thyroid hormone is also really important for growth and development, but we don't know the mechanisms of how exactly that's happening. But if you don't have it, then you won't be able to develop properly. Another thing that thyroid hormone does is support signaling in the sympathetic nervous system by increasing the number of alpha and beta receptors that are expressed on target cells. So if a target cell has a lot of alpha receptors or beta receptors, it's going to respond very strongly when the sympathetic nervous system is active. If it has few of those receptors, it's not going to be able to respond as much. And as you might imagine, essentially every cell in the body is affected by thyroid hormone. Another important endocrine gland that's partly controlled by the anterior pituitary gland is the adrenal gland. You have two parts of the adrenal gland, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. The cortex is on the outside, so the cortex is this part. The medulla is the inside, it's this part here. So the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline, in response to direct signaling from axons of the sympathetic nervous system. The hormones in the adrenal cortex are controlled more by the anterior pituitary. The adrenal cortex releases glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids primarily. The main glucocorticoid is cortisol. You have actually a lot of different hormones that all count as glucocorticoids, but the most important one is cortisol, or the most common one is cortisol. Then you also have a lot of hormones that count as mineralocorticoids, but the most important and most common one is aldosterone. Cortisol and the glucocorticoids are involved in the stress response. Their release is stimulated by ACTH from the anterior pituitary gland. The mineralocorticoids are involved in maintaining the water content of your blood and also maintaining the concentration of sodium, potassium, and chloride in the blood, and maintaining the pH of the blood. Its release is stimulated by ACTH from the anterior pituitary, but also by another hormone called angiotensin II, which we're going to talk more about in a moment. So ACTH is called adrenocorticotropic hormone because it causes the release of hormones from the adrenal cortex. So adrenocortico means adrenal cortex, and tropic means that it's causing the release of hormones from the adrenal cortex. You also have androgens released from the adrenal cortex. Those are hormones that are similar to testosterone. Not very much, but you do have some testosterone-like hormones released from the adrenal cortex. Then, of course, epinephrine from the adrenal medulla is involved in the kind of emergency response, fight versus flight. It's released anytime the sympathetic nervous system activates, and it enhances and prolongs the effects of the sympathetic nervous system because it also binds and activates alpha and beta receptors. So epinephrine is mainly controlled directly by axons of the sympathetic nervous system, but it can also have its release increased by ACTH and by cortisol. So cortisol and the glucocorticoids are really important in your response to stress. One of the main things they do is increase the glucose concentration in your blood. They do that by increasing the rate at which the liver is breaking down glycogen to make glucose, and by increasing the rate at which fat is broken down in adipose tissue, and by increasing the rate at which protein is broken down in muscle. Right, so all of those things can be used to increase glucose levels in the blood and or to make ATP. It's okay, kitty. I win. So another thing that cortisol and the glucocorticoids do is suppress the immune system. Right, so when they increase the glucose levels of your blood, that increases the nutrients you have available to respond to your stressful situation. And it's also important to have the immune system suppressed because stress is supposed to be something that kind of happens in the short term. It's not supposed to be like a long-term thing. Right, so it should be that something bad happens that's stressful, and then you respond to it, and you resolve that emergency. When you're resolving that emergency, it's important for you to not have a lot of inflammation, which is one of the main responses of the immune system to damage. Inflammation involves increasing pain sensitivity, so that if you hurt yourself, you're going to have, you wound a part of your body, you're going to have inflammation, and the area is going to be painful. That way you kind of are more careful with it so that it can heal and you don't re-injure it when it's trying to heal. But sometimes it's not good. So let's say, you saw a lion and you fall and twist your ankle, and then you need to get back up again and run. Your ankle is going to hurt, but you need to run anyways. So you need to have your inflammation being suppressed so you don't feel the pain, so that you can respond to the emergency. Corticosteroids are drugs that are related to glucocorticoids. They're synthetic glucocorticoids. Those are actually, it's the most powerful anti-inflammatory drugs that we have available right now by prescription. Right, because they really, the glucocorticoids really have a strong effect to suppress the immune system and suppress inflammation. Then another thing that the glucocorticoids and cortisol do is increase signaling in the sympathetic nervous system by upregulating the receptors. That means increasing how many alpha and beta receptors that target cells have on their membranes. It also increases the release of epinephrine. Right, so that I guess your stress response and your emergency response kind of go hand in hand. If you're stressed out, it's probably because it's time for fight versus flight. These systems really aren't kind of working well in our modern world. We don't have very many emergency situations where a fight versus flight response is required, but we do have so much stress, and it just doesn't stop. Right, so that's not really the way that it's supposed to go. Your stress is supposed to last for a short period of time, so you have cortisol released for a short time, and then it goes away. You also have a little bit of effect of the glucocorticoids on the kidneys to regulate water and ion content in the blood and pH of the blood, but that's kind of a minor effect. Almost every cell in the body is affected by cortisol and by the other glucocorticoids. And having those hormones is really important. It's actually, I guess we usually think of stress hormones like cortisol as being kind of bad for you. And what that actually means is that it's bad to be stressed out in the long term. That has negative health consequences, like suppressing your immune system, for instance. But it's not the cortisol that's bad, it's the stress that's bad. Cortisol is really important for allowing you to respond effectively to stress. Actually, if you're not able to make glucocorticoids or cortisol, if you get too stressed out, you'll actually die. And I haven't yet been able to figure out how this happens, but this is definitely something that happens. When you get stressed out, you have a lot of vasodilation. Your blood vessels, they get a lot bigger, and that can cause your blood pressure to crash, which can kill you. because you need the blood pressure to maintain blood flow to your organs. So cortisol helps you kind of prevent that from happening, right? By increasing sympathetic nervous system signaling in part, right? So you don't have extreme vasodilation when you get stressed out that leads to your death. So some people are born kind of without the ability to make cortisol, and that used to be a death sentence. Those people would kind of go on living until they had a major stressful life event, and then they would just die. And these days, we're able to make synthetic corticosteroids, and so if you're not able to make cortisol on your own, you can take these synthetic corticosteroid drugs to replace the cortisol, so that you're able to survive stress, basically. If you are that type of person, you'll have kind of a dose that you're supposed to take every day, but you'll also have extra pills, so that if something happens that really stresses you out, you can increase your dose. You need to increase your dose so that you can respond to that stressful event and, not die. Okay, so now we'll talk about the mineralocorticoids, which is the last major class of hormones released from the adrenal cortex. The most important mineralocorticoid hormone is aldosterone. It's considered part of the RAAS, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. The effects of aldosterone and the other mineralocorticoids are all on the kidneys. They act on the cells lining the kidney tubules, where urine would be formed. They change the concentration or the amount of ion channels and ion pumps that are in those cell membranes. And those ion channels and pumps are allowing ions to enter or exit the urine, adjusting the chemistry of the urine to be appropriate. When aldosterone is present, it causes channels to be inserted that allow sodium and chloride to leave the urine, that allow potassium to enter the urine, and allow hydrogen ions to enter the urine. So it's increasing retention of sodium and chloride, increasing excretion of potassium and hydrogen ions. You can remember those effects pretty easily if you remember where your ion concentrations are supposed to be high, either outside the cell or inside the cell. Right, in chapter 11 we learned that you have a high concentration of sodium and chloride ions outside of the cells, and inside the cells there's a high concentration of potassium ions. So it makes sense to get a high concentration of sodium and chloride ions in your fluid outside of the cells, that you would want to not excrete those things in the urine as much, but you would want to retain them in the body fluids. Then for potassium, since you want a low concentration outside the cells, it makes sense that you would want to excrete potassium into the urine, which reduces its concentration in the body fluids. Water is going to follow wherever the sodium moves when the urine is forming. So if sodium starts moving into the urine, water will move into the urine. If sodium starts moving out of the urine and is retained, then water will follow it out of the urine and be retained as well. So aldosterone's direct effects are on these ions, and then its effects on water retention are kind of secondary to the ion effects. Then finally, you can remember its effects on hydrogen ions by remembering the pH of the blood. It's supposed to be at pH 7.4, which is a little bit above neutral. Neutral pH is 7, so it's a little bit basic. Hydrogen ions are just protons, and when you have a lot of protons, that makes the solution very acidic. It makes it have a low pH. So when pH is going down below 7, you're gaining hydrogen ions. When pH is going up above 7, you're losing hydrogen ions. So compared to what you would have in just pure water. So in order to get the pH of the blood a little bit above 7 to 7.4, you have to lose some hydrogen ions. So it makes sense that aldosterone causes those ions to be excreted into the urine so that they leave your body fluids, helping you get a basic pH in the blood. Maintaining the pH at 7.4 is really important for the body. pH affects essentially every chemical reaction that's in the body. Some of the reactions are more sensitive to pH and some are less sensitive, but all of them are ultimately affected by the pH level. as well as the function of every protein in the body would be affected by pH level, essentially. And here's the RAAS. That's the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So the book doesn't talk about the RAAS yet, really. It mostly talks about it later in AMP2, actually, but I think it's important to talk about it in the hormone chapter because renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone are all considered hormones. And they're pretty important hormones also. The main function of the RAAS is to help maintain the blood pressure of the body, although it also acts to maintain ion and pH homeostasis since aldosterone is a part of the RAAS. So it begins when the kidneys make the hormone renin. Anytime blood pressure goes down, that's going to affect how much urine is being made in the kidneys. So the kidneys are able to sense when blood pressure drops or rises. If blood pressure drops, the kidneys will start to make renin. Then renin is going to convert the molecule angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensinogen and angiotensin 1 are both actually inactive. Angiotensinogen is made by the liver, and then when renin is secreted into the blood, it finds the angiotensinogen in the blood and converts it to angiotensin 1, which is still inactive. It needs to go through one more step to be active. That second step is when it's converted from angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2 by the enzyme ACE. ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. ACE would be found in the lungs. It's actually attached to the lining of the blood vessels in the lungs. Since it's attached to the blood vessels and it doesn't move in the blood, it's not considered a hormone. Angiotensin 2 has some effects. One of its effects is a tropic effect. It causes aldosterone to be released from the adrenal cortex. So aldosterone can be synthesized in response to ACTH from the anterior pituitary, but it could also be synthesized in response to angiotensin 2 as part of the RAAS. Then once aldosterone is released, that of course has the effects on the kidneys that we just talked about. One of those effects is to increase water retention. Anytime you have more water, less water leaving the body and then you're still drinking, you're going to get more volume in the body, ultimately of water, and that will increase the blood volume and that increases blood pressure. So if you have aldosterone released, one of the indirect effects would be to increase blood pressure. Angiotensin 2 also has other effects, non-tropic effects. One of the main things it does is cause vasoconstriction, which is constriction of the smooth muscle lining the blood vessels so that they get smaller. When you have vasoconstriction, blood pressure is going to go up also. Angiotensin 2 also has direct effects on the kidneys to increase the retention of sodium chloride in water. That's not as significant as aldosterone's effects, but is still present. And the last thing angiotensin 2 does is stimulate thirst. So it makes you feel thirsty, so you'll go drink water. Then since you're drinking water and retaining urine, your blood volume is going to start going up, which raises your blood pressure. So overall, the RAAS is a really important part of how the body is controlling blood pressure in the long term. I guess ACE has also become important right now because it's actually used by the coronavirus to gain entry into cells in the lungs. Just FYI. The next organ in the endocrine system we'll talk about is the parathyroid gland. This is the first one we're going to talk about that is not controlled by the pituitary gland. So the parathyroid gland makes the parathyroid hormone, abbreviated PTH. The role of parathyroid hormone is to increase calcium levels in the blood. Its release is controlled by the concentration of calcium in the blood that is sensed directly by cells in the parathyroid gland. So anytime calcium levels are dropping in the blood, the parathyroid cells can sense that and they will respond by releasing parathyroid hormone. If calcium levels rise in the blood, then they will stop making the parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone has multiple effects, all of which act to ultimately increase calcium levels in the blood. One of those effects is to stimulate the activity of osteoclasts in the bones. Remember, those are the cells in the bones that break down bone. Whenever you're breaking down bone, you're taking out the calcium from the bone and releasing it into the blood. So when parathyroid hormone stimulates the activity of those osteoclasts, it increases the rate at which calcium from the bones is taken into the blood. Another thing it does is activate vitamin D. Vitamin D, you would either get it from your diet or it would be made in your skin by the sun. But whether you're getting it from your diet or making it in your skin, it's inactive. Vitamin D is inactive when you first get it. It has to be activated by parathyroid hormone. Once it's activated, it will be able to act on the intestines to absorb calcium from the gut. So if you don't have active vitamin D, which is also called calcitriol, then you would not be able to absorb calcium from your gut no matter how much you eat. And then the last thing that parathyroid hormone does is increase the retention of calcium in the kidneys so that you're not losing it in your urine. The parathyroid gland it's a really small gland. It's next to the thyroid gland, and it's just several little lobes in the thyroid gland, kind of distributed around the thyroid gland in the throat. Most people will have kind of 3 to 5 little bits of parathyroid gland. It varies from person to person. Okay, next we'll talk about the pancreas, which is also part of the digestive system because it secretes digestive enzymes into the intestine. That's a type of exocrine secretion. Then it also has 3 hormones that it secretes into the blood, which are somatostatin, insulin, and glucagon. Somatostatin's role is to prevent the release of other hormones. So it inhibits the release of hormones from the pancreas. It inhibits the release of insulin and glucagon. It also inhibits the release of hormones related to digestion from other organs in the digestive system. The role of insulin is to lower your blood sugar. The role of glucagon is the opposite of that. It increases your blood sugar. Insulin and glucagon are mostly controlled locally by the pancreas itself. You have cells in the pancreas that are able to sense how much glucose is in the blood, and they release insulin or glucagon in response as appropriate. So if glucose levels go up in the blood, insulin would be released. If glucose levels go down, glucagon would be released instead. The nervous system also has some role to play in controlling the pancreas. The sympathetic nervous system will prevent the release of insulin from the pancreas. It will also increase the release of glucagon from the pancreas so that you can have, more blood sugar to meet your emergency. But also, actually, whenever you taste something sweet, your brain will tell the pancreas to start making insulin to prepare for the increase in blood sugar that's going to come when you're eating that sweet thing. So if we look a little closer at glucagon, increases glucose levels in the blood, both by increasing the breakdown of glycogen in the liver to make glucose, and by increasing the breakdown of protein and fat in muscle and adipose tissue. Protein and muscle and fat and adipose tissue. You can use those things to make ATP and indirectly to make glucose. Another thing that glucagon does is increase the formation of ketones from those fatty acids. So when you break down a fat, you get glycerol and fatty acids. The glycerol will be converted to glucose by the liver. The fatty acids can be used to make ATP, or they could be converted into ketones by the liver. And then those ketones can be used by most of the cells in your body as a replacement for glucose to make ATP. There's a few cells that aren't able to use ketones as fuel. One of the main cell types that can't use ketones would be the red blood cells in your blood. So you do need some blood sugar no matter what. But most of your cells can switch to running off of ketones instead. So that if If you have restricted access to sugar, then you can eat fat instead and live off of that. In particular, the neurons in your brain are able to use ketones instead of glucose. So this phenomenon is what's exploited by the ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet is a diet where you are trying to base your nutrition off of fat with also some protein and with very little carbohydrates. When you restrict your body's access to glucose like that, it'll only make the bare minimum that it actually needs to fuel the red blood cells and things that can't run off of ketones. Everything else will switch to running off of ketones. So then when your body is needing fuel, it will take it either from the ketones that you've eaten or from your own fat stores. And in contrast, when you're eating carbohydrates, if you eat a lot of carbs or a lot of kind of simple starches or sugars, that causes your blood sugar to spike. Then you have insulin released from the pancreas that causes your cells to take up that blood sugar to lower your blood sugar. One of the things, the cells can only take up so much. So one of the things that's going to happen is your fat cells will take up the sugar and use it to make fat. So it's actually not eating fat that makes fat cells, that makes adipose cells, create fat. It's eating sugar. They make fat out of sugar. They do not take fat from the blood and store it. The other major hormone released from the pancreas is insulin, which the ultimate effect of insulin is the opposite of glucagon. Glucagon increases sugar in the blood, insulin decreases it, but insulin does that in a different way. So glucagon increases blood sugar by making the liver, the muscle, and the fat release sugar or things that can be converted to sugar. Insulin decreases blood sugar by telling cells to take sugar up from the blood. It actually affects every cell in your body and tells those cells to take up sugar from the blood. It'll also increase the uptake of fatty acids and amino acids from the blood. Every cell is able to get actually some blood sugar without insulin, but most cells in your body can't get as much as what they need to run themselves without insulin. There's a few exceptions to that. The liver, the brain, the red blood cells, and certain cells in the pancreas are able to take up glucose without insulin. They can take up large amounts of glucose without insulin and run themselves without insulin. The other tissues in your body can take up a little bit of glucose without insulin, but not enough. Not enough. They need insulin. So that means that if you don't have the insulin, that's a major problem for your body. Another thing that insulin does is cause the liver to store glucose as glycogen. So your cells, when they take up glucose, most cells can't really store it. They have to use it right then to make ATP, so they can only take up, so much at a time. So if you have extra sugar beyond what your regular cells are able to take up, that extra sugar is going to get taken up by the liver in part, and the liver will use it to make glycogen. The other type of cell that will take it up is adipocytes in your adipose tissue, and they will use the sugar to make fat. Another effect that insulin has is to promote satiety, which means that it makes you feel full and satisfied. Then we have the thymus. There's actually debate about whether the thymus is an endocrine organ at all. Most of the hormones that it releases actually seem to act in a paracrine manner, so they act on the local tissue. They don't really need to travel in the blood to have their effect, which makes it a little unclear whether it should be considered part of the endocrine system at all. It's definitely part of the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system kind of overlaps a lot with the immune system. The thymus is also part of the immune system. The main role of the thymus is to mature T cells. T cells are a type of immune cell. They're actually called T cells because they mature in the thymus. They're really important for your immune system being able to activate fully and being able to destroy pathogens. If you don't have those T cells, you're essentially immunocompromised and you won't be able to fight off infections. So the thymus is extremely important in your immune system. The thymus is a really unusual organ because it's large in children and infants, and as you grow, it shrinks and shrinks. By the time you get through puberty or get to adulthood, you have very little thymus left. Most of it has been replaced by adipose tissue at that point. You do still have a tiny bit, like a tiny bit of thymus left, and you need the thymus to produce T cells. Well, to mature them. The T cells are actually produced in the bone marrow and they're matured in the thymus. If they're not matured, though, they're really not worth anything to you. So most of those T cells are going to be matured in your childhood and they're supposed to last you your whole life. You only have a small ability to make more T cells that are effective as an adult. So there's a couple of compounds or molecules released by the thymus, thymopoietin and thymosin, that have been considered hormones, but they're not really like hormones because they actually act locally in the thymus to mature the T cells. So thymopoietin and thymosin are for maturing T cells, and they're a type of paracrine secretion because they act locally. You actually have other molecules that are very close to thymosin, so there are other types of thymosin molecules that are hormones that are released. They're released by different tissues, not by the thymus itself. So those are hormones because they enter the blood and have an effect at a distant site, not where they were released. But since they're not released from the thymus, are they really thymic hormones? Not really. Maybe thymopoietin and thymosin could have some hormonal role, some endocrine role. They might help maintain the maturity of T cells that are already circulating in your bloodstream. That's not really clear though. Then finally you have thymulin, which is actually a proper hormone that's released from the thymus. Thymulin acts on the anterior pituitary gland to foster its growth and development. So actually, if you don't have thymulin, your anterior pituitary will not develop correctly, and you won't be able to release those stimulating hormones appropriately. That's going to have serious effects on your thyroid gland, on your adrenal glands, and on your ovaries or testes. Yeah, and that's the thymus. Then we have the pineal gland, which is the little one at the back of the brain, the back and base of the brain. The only hormone released by the pineal gland is melatonin, and the action of melatonin is to stimulate sleep, so it acts on the brain to stimulate sleep. The hypothalamus controls the release of melatonin from the pineal gland, and if you remember, in the hypothalamus you have your master clock. That master clock is getting input from light from the eyes. So some of the visual information from your eyes is going through the thalamus to the visual cortex, but some of that information is also just going straight into the hypothalamus to the master clock. So the master clock can know if it's light or not, if it's night or day. Then the master clock in the hypothalamus will tell the pineal gland whether or not it should be releasing melatonin. Melatonin should be released in the darkness, and it should not be released in the light. So this is a type of direct control by the nervous system. So it's controlled by the nervous system, but not through the anterior pituitary. So that is similar to how the adrenal medulla is controlled. This would be one reason why you can have trouble going to sleep if you look at lights late at night, especially blue light, because it's actually specifically just blue light that goes to the master clock in the hypothalamus and controls release of melatonin. So if you have a filter on your screens to remove blue light, that can help you release melatonin more naturally at night and go to sleep more naturally if you have trouble. The way that melatonin actually promotes sleep is by inhibiting the reticular activating system in the brainstem. Remember, you need that system to maintain your consciousness. So melatonin turns it off so that you can lose consciousness for the night. The rest of the organs and tissues we're going to talk about are not part of the endocrine system, but they do release hormones. So we'll mention the hormones that they release. I mean, just some of them, not all of them. So first you have adipose tissue. That's not a hormone. That's not an organ, of course. That's a tissue. But it does release the hormone leptin. Leptin acts in the brain to promote satiety, again meaning that it makes you feel full and like you don't want to eat anymore. Leptin is always released by adipose tissue on a constant basis, but different hormones that act on adipose tissue can cause more leptin or less leptin to be released. So the way it should work is that as you eat more, you are able to put on more weight and you get more adipose tissue. And then since you have more adipose tissue, you have more leptin released. Since all adipose tissue is releasing that leptin, and then that acts on the brain to make you less hungry, thereby kind of regulating your weight. Of course, this system has become completely deranged in our modern world. It really wasn't built to handle just refined sugars and convenience stores and advertising and stuff. Then you have the stomach and the intestine, which act together to release several hormones important for your digestion. First, you have ghrelin. Ghrelin is sort of like the opposite of leptin. So leptin makes you not hungry, ghrelin makes you hungry. It also stimulates growth hormone secretion from the anterior pituitary. Then you have gastrin that increases the release of stomach acid into the stomach. That is a type of exocrine secretion. Well, the excretion of gastrin is endocrine, but the excretion of stomach acid in the stomach is exocrine. And then you have cholecystokinin, abbreviated CKK. That increases the secretion of digestive enzymes from the pancreas and from the gallbladder that help you digest your food. That's also a type of exocrine secretion. Those are just 3 of the most important hormones that are released from the stomach and intestine. There's actually very many hormones released from those organs, some of which are found in the image, but actually not all of them. Most hormones that come from the stomach and the intestine are related to digestion primarily, and they would either be targeting organs in the digestive system or the brain, which is controlling, eating behavior. Then you have the heart. The heart releases a couple of hormones, atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP, and brain natriuretic peptide, or BNP. Brain natriuretic peptide is actually misnamed. It's released from the ventricles, not from the brain. The ventricles are the bottom chambers of the heart that are pumping blood out to the body. So you have your BNP is released from the ventricles. Your ANP is released from the atria of the heart, which would be the top chambers. The atria are allowing blood to pass from the body into the ventricles. Both of these hormones, ANP and BNP, have similar effects, and both of them are released by high blood pressure. So whenever you have high blood pressure, you're going to have generally more blood coming back into the heart. And when you have more blood in the heart, it stretches the walls of the heart, and that stretch causes the release of ANP and BNP. ANP if it's stretched in the atria, BNP if they're stretched in the ventricles. Then those hormones act on the blood vessels to cause vasodilation, right? So they make the blood vessels bigger in diameter by relaxing the smooth muscle around them. That reduces your blood pressure. It also increases, both of them also increase the excretion of sodium by the kidneys, and then since you have sodium being excreted, water is going to follow it, so water is excreted more as well. So when you're losing more water in the urine, you reduce your blood volume, and that also reduces your blood pressure. So that's 2 different, mechanisms by which ANP and BNP are decreasing your blood pressure. That way, your blood pressure kind of remains stable and your heart isn't put under too much stress. You also have some hormones released by the kidneys. We'd already mentioned renin that's released in response to low blood pressure that activates the RAAS by activating angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Then angiotensin 1 is activated to angiotensin 2 by ACE. Then angiotensin 2 causes the release of aldosterone and also causes vasodilation and thirst. Then you also have erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is the hormone that causes red blood cells to be produced in the bone marrow. So the bone marrow is where all of your blood cells are made. Also, a lot of other types of cells are made in the bone marrow. And erythropoietin is specifically stimulating the production of red blood cells. In general, if your oxygen levels go down, then the kidneys will start releasing erythropoietin. Then your bone marrow will make more red blood cells, and the ability of your blood to carry oxygen will increase, and your oxygen levels will increase. The kidneys are also responsible for activating vitamin D in part. So you actually need two things similar to angiotensinogen being activated to angiotensin 2 in a two-step process. To actually activate vitamin D fully, you need the parathyroid hormone, but you'll also need enzymes in the kidneys to finish activating it. And then that increases calcium absorption from your gut. I should mention erythropoietin, that's abbreviated EPO. That's one of the drugs that's frequently abused by athletes to increase their performance because it increases how many red blood cells they have, how much oxygen their blood can carry. That increases their endurance. You also have some hormones released from the liver. So we had already mentioned IGF, insulin-like growth factor. That stimulates your cells to divide and make protein for your growth and your development. Release of IGF is controlled by growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. Then you also have thrombopoietin coming from the liver. That's a little bit similar to the erythropoietin from the kidneys. It acts in the bone marrow to stimulate the production of platelets, which would be little cell fragments that allow your blood to clot if you get a cut. Then you also have hepcidin released from the liver. Hepcidin is responsible for maintaining the iron concentration in your blood. It actually reduces the amount of iron that you have in your blood. You always have hepcidin being released from the liver. Then if your iron levels start dropping, then you reduce how much hepcidin you release. So the main reason why you need iron, I mean, there's multiple systems in the body that require iron. The main one, though, is your red blood cells require iron for their hemoglobin so they can bind to oxygen. If they actually don't have the iron, then they can't bind to oxygen or carry it. Whenever your red blood cells die, the iron in them is recycled. So generally, you shouldn't be losing too much iron. And that means that you usually don't need to take it in either, and hepcidin prevents that from happening. Another thing the liver does, of course, is make angiotensinogen, which would then be converted to angiotensin 1 by renin and to angiotensin 2 by ACE for the RAAS. So there's a lot of homeostatic variables that we talked about that are affected by more than one hormone. This is just kind of a summary of those and the hormones that are involved. So first you have plasma glucose. Insulin is the only hormone that decreases that, which would be the level of blood sugar that you have. You also have several hormones that increase blood sugar, which would be the glucagon, growth hormone, and cortisol and the other glucocorticoids. Blood pressure is also affected by multiple hormones. ANP and BNP decrease blood pressure. The rest of the hormones that affect it all increase it. So you have ADH, aldosterone, angiotensin 2, and epinephrine that all work to increase the blood pressure. Then you have signaling in the sympathetic nervous system that's affected by multiple hormones. That would be thyroid hormone, cortisol, and the other glucocorticoids, and epinephrine itself. So thyroid hormone and cortisol and the glucocorticoids both act to increase the number of alpha and beta receptors that are on target cells for the sympathetic nervous system. Then epinephrine actually binds those receptors and activates them, just like norepinephrine released from sympathetic neurons does. Then you have a bunch of hormones involved in this stress response. So you have thyroid hormone, glucagon, the RAAS, cortisol, and the other glucocorticoids and epinephrine are all directly involved in the stress response. Also, growth hormone may play a role in the stress response as well. All of those hormones together are kind of coordinating the stress response. Some of those effects that are part of the stress response are increasing glucose in the blood, increasing blood pressure, and increasing sympathetic nervous system signaling. Okay, so that's all the information that's going to be on the test. Now we'll go through some of the diseases that are related to hormones, but none of this is on the test. So in general, most endocrine disorders are caused by having too much of the hormone or not enough of the hormone. Sometimes you have another problem where the receptors on the target cells for the hormone aren't acting correctly or something's different about them. If you have too much hormone, then you're hyper for that hormone. If you have too little of the hormone, you're hypo for that hormone. In general, if you have too much, that could be because you have a tumor in that particular endocrine organ, which is secreting hormone. You could also have a tumor in the pituitary gland or in the hypothalamus that's secreting hormone. Whenever you have too much of a hormone, all those little smaller secondary effects are going to be more noticeable, and they may become symptoms of that disorder. If you have too little hormone, there's a couple of reasons that might happen. First, you could have a genetic problem, and you're not able to make the hormone in the first place. Second, you could have had some type of physical trauma or other type of damage to the endocrine organ that should be making the hormone, or to the anterior pituitary gland or the hypothalamus. So that could be, right, like physical damage, or that could also be something related to a medicine side effect or a drug or toxin that you were exposed to, or it could also be an autoimmune problem where your immune system itself is attacking that organ and damaging it. Lastly, sometimes you might make a hormone, but it doesn't work. So effectively, you would have too little of that hormone. In general, if the sensitivity of the target cells is going to be altered as part of an endocrine disorder, it would mean that you don't have enough of those receptors, or that the receptors you have don't work. Usually it's not that you have too many. If you have too few or they don't work, that's going to kind of look like a hypo disorder where you have too little hormone. So for hormones that are controlled through the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, you could have problems with those hormones that are caused by the endocrine organs that release them, or by the anterior pituitary, or by the hypothalamus. If it's a primary hyper or hypo disorder, then you have a problem with the actual endocrine organ that makes the hormone that you have too little or too much of. If it's a secondary hyper or hypo problem, then you have an issue with the anterior pituitary. If it's a tertiary problem, your issue is with the hypothalamus itself. If you have some problem with your anterior pituitary gland or with your hypothalamus, like physical damage to those areas, then it's possible that more than just one hormone could be affected. You could be hypo, for instance, for multiple different hormones and have multiple endocrine disorders. You can tell which level the disorder is at, primary, secondary, or tertiary, by measuring the blood concentrations for the endocrine organ or the hormone itself that's being affected, and for the stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, and for the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So for instance, and that's because of the negative feedback. So for instance, if you had a tumor in your pituitary gland that was secreting TSH, that was secreting thyroid stimulating hormone, that would be acting on the thyroid gland to make a lot of thyroid hormone. Then that thyroid hormone is going to prevent the secretion of thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH, from the hypothalamus. So you should have low TRH, high TSH, and high TH if you have a tumor in the pituitary gland that's secreting TSH. On the other hand, if you had damage to the thyroid gland itself and it can't make thyroid hormone, then you should have really high TSH and TRH, because your hypothalamus is sensing that there's not enough thyroid hormone and is just trying to have more get made. So doctors will look at those different hormone levels to tell where the problem is at. That's really helpful because, it's hard to get in to look at the anterior pituitary gland or the hypothalamus. So here we're going to go through some specific endocrine disorders. For antidiuretic hormone, if you have too little of that, that's called diabetes insipidus. So if you have too little ADH, you have trouble hanging on to your water and you make too much urine, which means that you pee a lot, but you're also going to be thirsty a lot. If you have too much ADH, that's called SIAD, or Syndrome of Inappropriate ADH Secretion. And that means that you're going to be retaining too much water, your blood pressure will be high, but also the concentration of ions in your blood is going to be low because they're being diluted by all the extra water. So that can cause a lot of serious problems. If you have a problem with GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, with growth hormone itself, or with IGF, you're going to get either pituitary dwarfism, if you have too little of one of those, well, of IGF ultimately, or if you have too much IGF ultimately, you'll have gigantism or acromegaly. Right, in pituitary dwarfism, you are basically too short. In gigantism or acromegaly, you're too big. People who have acromegaly will also generally have like long faces and hands and feet that are unusually large or disproportionately large. If you have problems with thyroid hormone or the other hormones related to regulating thyroid hormone, you would either be hypothyroid or hyperthyroid. A couple of the most common, well, there's a lot of different, I guess there's a lot of hypothyroid disorders and a lot of hyperthyroid disorders, but the most common ones would be Hashimoto thyroiditis or an iodine deficiency and Graves' disease. In Hashimoto thyroiditis, the immune system attacks the thyroid gland. So there's several different ways that can happen, but in one way or another, the immune system is recognizing the thyroid gland as foreign and attacking it. So it's progressively damaged as you get older. In iodine deficiency, you're not taking in enough iodine in your diet, and you need iodine to make thyroid hormone, so you're not able to make thyroid hormone without the iodine. Both of those would be hypothyroid disorders, where you end up with too little thyroid hormone. The symptoms are going to be, a little different depending on which specific thyroid disorder you have, but in general, hypothyroid symptoms would involve weight gain, feeling very low energy and fatigued and sleeping a lot, and feeling cold also. In Graves' disease, the immune system actually, it's a little bit weird. The immune system makes antibodies that actually look like TSH. So those antibodies will act on the thyroid gland to cause the production of thyroid hormone in excessive amounts. That is going to give you a hyperthyroid disorder where you are losing weight, you can't keep on the weight, you have very little appetite, you have trouble sleeping and insomnia, you will be like restless and anxious, and oh yeah, you may feel hot. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention for hypothyroid disorders, a common symptom of that would be depression also. I actually know someone who has a hypothyroid disorder, and it's ridiculous. He just can't stop putting on weight no matter like what he eats or how little he eats. It's crazy. If you have a problem with aldosterone, you could be hypo or hyper. Also, if you had a problem with any of the many enzymes and hormones involved in regulating aldosterone, you can get a hypo or hyperaldosterone disorder as well. So if you have problems with renin, with angiotensinogen or angiotensin 2 or angiotensin 1, or if you have problems with ACE or CRH or ACTH or aldosterone itself, you could end up with an aldosterone disorder. If you have too little aldosterone, you would be, well, that would be considered hypoaldosteronism. If you have too much, The most common cause of having too much aldosterone is Cohen's syndrome, in which you have a tumor in the adrenal cortex that releases aldosterone. In either case, you're going to have problems potentially with your blood pressure, but most significantly with your ion concentrations, either too much or too little of the different ions in your blood. That's going to cause serious effects in many systems in the body. If you have a problem with cortisol, it could either be too much or too little. If you have problems with CRH or ACTH, those are also going to cause problems with cortisol or the other glucocorticoids. The most common cause of having too little is Addison disease. The most common cause of having too much is Cushing's syndrome. Addison's disease is also called adrenal insufficiency, and it's basically related to not being able to make cortisol. So it's a problem with the adrenal cortex where maybe it was damaged and it can't release cortisol now, or it could be genetic as well. That is a very serious disorder that untreated will lead to death as soon as you have a major stressful life event. So people who have Addison's disease or adrenal insufficiency have to take synthetic glucocorticoids or corticosteroids in order to have a normal stress response. And again, I haven't been able to figure out why yet, but if you get stressed out, your blood pressure drops if you don't have cortisol, and it will actually drop so low that you die. So those people have to have their regular amount of their corticosteroid drug, but also an additional set of kind of buffered doses, so if something stressful happens, they can take more to respond to it. Then if you have too much, that's the main cause would be Cushing's syndrome. In Cushing's syndrome, you gain weight, you'll have high blood pressure, but at the same time you'll have very weak muscles and weak bones. Your bones will break very easily, and your skin also will just take a really long time to heal. You also might be just tired all the time. There's multiple causes for Cushing's syndrome. Actually, one way to get it is to take too much corticosteroids for too long a time. That can also cause Cushing's syndrome. Oh, and I should mention another symptom of Cushing's syndrome is a suppressed immune system, so that you're more vulnerable to infections, which would be probably one of the main problems with taking corticosteroid drugs for too long a time if you don't absolutely need them. Then you have problems with insulin, of course, that are very common. If you have too little insulin, that is diabetes mellitus type 1. If you have too much insulin, that's diabetes mellitus type 2. So when we say diabetes, we're either talking about type 1 or type 2. We're talking about some problem with insulin. But you'll also have diabetes insipidus. That's different. That's related to ADH, not insulin. It's diabetes mellitus that is related to insulin. So in type 1 diabetes, you have some problem with the pancreas where it's not able to produce insulin. Could be, again, genetic or some type of damage that occurred early in life. It usually has an early onset. That can also be fatal, and it generally was fatal before we were able to make insulin, because there's a lot of cells in your body that aren't able to take up sufficient glucose for their needs if they don't have insulin. In diabetes type 2, that's actually that's a problem with the insulin receptors on the target cells. You have what's called insulin insensitivity, where those receptors don't respond to insulin the right way. So you have insulin released like normal, but then the cells don't respond like normal. They don't take up sugar like normal from the blood. Then your pancreas is going to respond. It's going to notice that the blood sugar is high, and it's going to respond by releasing more insulin. So you actually can end up having too much insulin circulating, or more than what would be normal, but it's not enough for you because your receptors aren't working right. In diabetes type 2, you can also have kind of progressive damage to the pancreas, so that by the end you may not be able to release insulin anymore on your own either. In either case, you have too much sugar in your blood. That is actually very bad for you, because that means you're going to be having chemical reactions with that sugar occurring in the blood. And those reactions generate reactive oxygen species, or ROS. Those are chemicals that are very reactive and very damaging. They damage proteins, they damage DNA. So when you have too much blood sugar, that causes, over time, gradually over time, it causes damage to the lining of your blood vessels and then to the tissue outside that lining in the organs. It causes, a lot of damage to your delicate tissues and organs throughout your body.